I've done been really lucky to have done a series of books with Chomsky, and working with him over the years, I've really been struck by his consistency, his patience, and equanimity. And in terms of his intellectual chops, he's awesome in his syncretic ability to take a wide and disparate amount of information and cobble it into a coherent analysis. And like the Dorje thunderbolt of Tibetan Buddhism, Chomsky, with relentless logic, peels away and devastates the layers of deceit and deception produced by the embedded journalists of the corporate media and the mandarins of state power and American empire. Always, he reminds us, as he did this afternoon on the lawn of the Boulder Public Library, addressing a large gathering there, that the responsibility is up to us. We, the citizens, really must change the society and culture if we want to see a world of peace and social justice and democracy in this country. Earlier, David Horowitz. But Chomsky does have his critics, and one must acknowledge them, and one of the leading critics is someone named David Horowitz. He wrote an article called The Sick Mind of Noam Chomsky. And this is not untypical of the kind of vitriol and loathing that is directed toward this incredibly mild-mannered and self-effacing man. This is what Horowitz says. You know, we have to do like good journalists, ping-pong journalists, the good and the bad. Okay. His venomous message is spread on tapes and CDs and the lecture circuit. Chomsky's influence is best understood not that as of a intellectual figure, but as the leader of a secular religious cult, as the Ayatollah of anti-American hate. This guy's deep. This guy's deep. This cultic resonance is recognized by his followers. His most important devotee, David Barsanyan, is an obscure public radio producer on KGNU in Boulder, Colorado, who has created a library of Chomsky screeds on tape. All right. Fair and balanced. We report, you decide. Well, Chomsky at 74 is indefatigable. He spoke last night before thousands in Denver. He's leaving early in the morning to give 2 talks in Los Angeles. He is, as Bono of U2 once called him, a rebel without a pause. And he draws huge audiences wherever he goes, and he's literally booked years in advance. As he once told me, I'm not a charismatic speaker, and if I had the capacity to do so, I wouldn't use it. I'm really not interested in persuading people. What I like to do is help people persuade themselves. Often Chomsky is introduced as someone who exemplifies the Quaker adage of speaking truth to power. He actually takes exception to that. He says the powerful already know what's going on. It's the people who need to hear the truth. And now, celebrating 25 years of KGNU, please welcome Noam Chomsky.
One of the things I've learned from many years of not being a charismatic speaker is that my voice doesn't carry very well. So tell me if you can hear me before I... Okay? Yeah. We're all aware that right at this moment, bodies are being torn to shreds by infernal weapons. Unknown numbers of people who have already been driven to the edge of survival by a decade of murderous sanctions, may be facing starvation and slow death. Under these circumstances, it's not very easy to step back and try to ask why all this is happening, where it's likely to go, and what we can do to shape the future. But that's what I want to try to do. About the last question, what we can do to shape the future, the answer is straightforward, quite a lot. In fact, there's no one anywhere who can do as much as we can. We're uniquely privileged. We have unusual freedom. That's not a gift from on high. It's a legacy that was won by centuries of constant, dedicated struggle, and that's really the answer to what we can do. Pay attention to the legacy and carry it forward. Privilege and advantages confer responsibility. That should be truism. What comes next is hard, though, personal choices. One choice is to face the responsibility. Not easy, though a lot easier than it is in other countries, other places not as privileged as we are. The other choice is to shirk the responsibility and hand the future over to be determined by forces that we can be sure are not benign. Well, many people in the world, probably the vast majority as far as we know, are hoping, and probably desperately hoping, that we will make the first choice, face the responsibility. And they view with dread the consequences if we do not act to control what they see as a juggernaut that's they regard as the greatest threat to peace in the world, and these days threat to peace means literally threat to survival. Well, not everyone is dismayed. So take Osama bin Laden. If he's alive somewhere, I'm sure he's enjoying mightily the scenes that are portrayed in one way on television here and in a different way by correspondents and commentators who are not embedded within the invading system. He's made it very clear what he wants. He wants a war to the death between the evil empire and the billions of people around the world, and that's what he's getting. The political, even before the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. political leadership had inspired extraordinary level of fear throughout the world, not just the Arab and the Muslim world. Since the invasion, the war that the world is seeing, not the one being portrayed here, that war has aroused a wave of revulsion that's actually becoming a serious concern even to policymakers here, and it's reaching the mainstream press. So just in the last few days, the mainstream press has been publishing lead articles about it. They report, give you some quotes, a growing hatred of America, regarded as a violent aggressor, a cruel aggressor that's relying on overwhelming force to crush anyone who's in its way, and worse still, it seems to be rejoicing in its ability to destroy a defenseless enemy, people shooting with rusting rifles at tanks and bombers. The rejoicing over that is not inspiring great love around the world. Furthermore, Saddam Hussein has been transformed by the invasion. He was regarded as a thug and a despot and hated, and he's becoming a hero. A brave, I'm quoting again, a brave and noble man. His praises gush from the lips of Arabs from nearly every walk of life. I was quoting long experienced American reporters in Jordan in this case. The director of the Center for Strategic Studies in Jordan says that without doubt, Saddam now occupies the high moral ground across the Arab world. And he finds that very disturbing. Thinks it's going to cause huge problems for countries like Jordan and Egypt, especially if there's any step towards democratization, because the voice of the people is heard. He knows what voice it's going to be. It's going to be the voice of radical Islamists who are calling for a war against America, and also secular nationalists who despise Saddam Hussein but now admire him because he's standing up to the savage Americans and no one else is. And in death, he's likely to become an even greater hero. There have been polls recently taken by American academics of the Arab world. And what they find is also a cause for a lot of concern. A huge majority from all over, from Morocco to the Gulf states and Lebanon, a huge majority want Islamic clergy to play a greater role in government. About 95% are convinced that the United States has no interest in the region beyond maintaining control over its oil. And incidentally, those concerns go back 50 years. That was the reason for what President Eisenhower called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world back in the late 1950s. Nothing new about it. They're convinced now, too, that the U.S. has no interest, and he, incidentally, and his staff concluded that that was correct. That is their interest. And they were supporting oppressive and governments and preventing development because of the interest in maintaining control over Middle East oil. That's the 1950s, not today. Now, 95% are convinced that that's still the interest, along with protecting Israeli power and humiliating Arabs and Muslims, or anybody who's in the way, relying on the fact that they have an overwhelming monopoly of violence. By now, they even speak of Saddam Hussein with reverence, even though they hate him as a murderous tyrant. Well, one recent story, and the big, long story in the Washington Post about all this, opens by saying something ominous is brewing that does not portend well for the United States. And that's an understatement. It does not. Now, that's quite an achievement by George W. Bush and his associates. These discussions are referring to the Arab and the Muslim world. Actually, that's the world that they claim to be liberating. In fact, it extends far beyond. It seems to be worldwide. It's not the last few days, though it's gotten much more extreme. If somebody was watching all of this from outer space, they might be led to believe that George Bush was embedded in the White House as an agent of Osama bin Laden. He's certainly acting that way. Well, you know, we can... unfortunately, it's not a joke. It does not portend well. The consequences could be very grim. Well, we got choices on this too. We can decide to live in a cocoon, the cocoon that's created by television and embedded commentators. We can admire ourselves for our magnificence, or we can look at what the world thinks and ask why. People have to decide for themselves what's the wisest and most admirable course. I don't think it's a hard decision. Well, as I said, going back, we can go the fear of the United States, of its leadership, particularly this political leadership, although it actually goes beyond. That goes back well before the invasion of Iraq. It was bad before, but within a year, Bush and his advisors have turned the United States into a pariah state. It's greatly feared throughout the world. It's regarded as the greatest threat to world peace by substantial majorities. Back as last October, the national press was forced to recognize, I'm quoting, that the world is more concerned about the unbridled use of American power than they are about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Actually, that's an understatement. No matter how much the world hates Saddam Hussein, it's only in the United States that he's feared. No one else regarded him as a threat, including his neighbors. They hate him, but they're not afraid of him. That's a special U.S. property. That's reached the point where the fear and concern over U.S. power has been featured in the national media recently. Cover stories in Newsweek and the Washington Post recently. There's one of the major polling centers, the research centers, is the Pew Center, Pew Research Center, recently published a poll on the image of the United States around the world, Europe mainly. It's plummeted. It's particularly Bush and his associates. In most places it's still dissociated from the country, though there are some exceptions like Poland and Turkey where the country is feared and hated. But it'll follow. If they keep at it, it'll follow. It'll be not them, but everyone. The head of the non-aligned movement, that's governments of roughly 80% of the world's population, former colonies basically, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia, who's very pro-American, very much part of the whole U.S. International economic project, what's absurdly called globalization. He recently said that the United States today, under the current leadership, is more dangerous to the world than Hitler. That wasn't reported here. We want to stay in the cocoon, but it was reported elsewhere, like England. You want to get out of the cocoon, you should know that. Well, you look beyond, it gets, in some ways, even more remarkable. You all know, I'm sure, that every year the World Economic Forum has a meeting usually in Davos, Switzerland. It's usually very upbeat and enthusiastic. Not this year. This year there was an atmosphere of what the press called gloom. The theme of the meeting last January was building trust. And the reason for that was that the World Economic Forum had just done a poll which they'd released about trust in leadership around the world, and they'd found a sharp decline in trust. There was only one, they had various categories. The only category that had even a majority of, a slight majority of the population trusting them was non-governmental organizations. Right below them came the UN and spiritual and religious leaders. Below them were Western European leaders. Keep going down, you get the corporate managers. The very bottom, leaders of the United States. It's pretty amazing. Colin Powell was sent there by the administration as their emissary. He had a very rough time. He was bitterly condemned. The focus of the meeting was the coming war with Iraq, which they were strongly opposed to, and they weren't by no means impressed with Powell's proclamation that the U.S. Declares the sovereign right to use force as it wishes. It's going to lead, even if nobody's following. Didn't win a lot of hearts and minds. This, remember, is the core of the international establishment. These are the people who the business press calls the masters of the universe. It includes corporate executives who are paying $30,000 each to attend, and major figures everywhere. That kind of opposition to government policy is completely without precedent. And it extends right to the United States, at the heart of the elite opposition to the political leadership is, again, extraordinary. The major foreign affairs journals, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and others. Popular opposition also has absolutely no precedent. There was an international Gallup poll. It wasn't reported here. Again, preference for the cocoon last December. The results were pretty interesting. We'll run through them, but just one result, one question asked had to do with the war that Bush and Blair and Powell and the rest are declaring and are now carrying out, a war that they carry out without any calling themselves the Allies, but they're allied only in the sense that they're allied against almost universal world opinion. The coalition forces, as the propaganda system calls them. A war carried out by them didn't even barely reach 10% support in any of the countries polled. The opposition in Europe was greatest in the countries that were where the leadership was lining up with Washington over the overwhelming opposition of their own population. That's incidentally being lauded here in a demonstration of hatred and contempt for democracy that also has no precedent. David was making jokes about France, but the reason for why France and Germany are so reviled is that the governments are taking the position of the overwhelming majority of the population. And that's considered a crime. It's a pretty striking fact. The governments that are praised, what Rumsfeld calls the New Europe, they're countries where the leadership is taking their orders from Crawford, Texas, and disregarding, 90% of the population. Those are the good guys. Now, what this tells you about the attitude towards democracy among elites here is pretty astonishing. Don't have to comment on it. I'm sure you noticed that the biggest demonstrations by far in mid-February, were in the countries where the leadership was going along with the United States, Italy and Spain. Same figures are same right through Eastern Europe. So Hungary, for example, has also about 80 or 90% opposition to the war under any circumstances. The Latin America, of course, overwhelming opposition. There's always overwhelming opposition there to U.S. military intervention, which they've had a little bit of experience with. When the Allies had to have their summit meeting, in which they presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, and not to Iraq. They presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, Bush, Blair, Aznar, saying, you follow us in 24 hours or else. Where did they meet? Well, they couldn't meet in any country where there are people around. That's too dangerous. They met in a U.S. military base on an island. That's where you got to meet, like the World Trade Organization, which had to meet in Doha to make sure there's no demonstrations, be surrounded by navies. That tells you a lot. Well, it's a real achievement, and you really have to ask how, let's say you're this Martian observer, how did Bush and his associates manage to make themselves the most feared and hated political leadership in the world, in fact, maybe ever, shaming the country and ultimately endangering its people? How'd they do it? Well, you look back, you can see how they did it. Just without running through the whole story, just start last September, because there was a big change then. Last September, a lot of important things happened, and they made an effect on world and U.S. opinion. The first and most important was the declaration in late September of the National Security Strategy. Immediately and surprisingly, it was harshly criticized in the main establishment International Affairs Journal, Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, which they do it in sort of muted terms, but you could see the concern. It was called an Imperial Grand Vision. The government announced a pretty remarkable doctrine. Basically, what it came down to is that the U.S. is going to rule the world by force. That's the dimension in which it has overwhelming dominance. The U.S. probably outspends the rest of the world combined in military force by now. It's going to rule the world by force, and it's going to do it indefinitely. If the U.S. government perceives any potential challenge to its domination of the world, it's going to destroy it. That's the doctrine that was announced. It's usually in the press, it's called a doctrine of preemptive war. That's not what they announced. Preemptive war has a meaning. It means that if you're under attack, you're under imminent threat of attack, like, say, remember back in 1983, the Russians were going to bomb us from an airbase in Grenada. Well, okay, say the Russian planes are in Grenada and they're flying to Florida about to bomb us, then a preemptive war would mean you're allowed to shoot them down before they bomb, and maybe even bomb the threatening airbase in Grenada. That's preemptive war. It has to be an imminent attack that's taking place. That's not what was proposed in September. What was proposed is that they can attack anybody they decide to call a potential threat. Sometimes that's called preventive war, but even that's not fair because they're allowed to invent the threat. It's not preventing anything necessarily. That's the doctrine that was announced. The goal, to quote somebody else, was to use force to prevent any challenge to the power, position, and prestige of the United States. And no legal issue arises if the U.S. acts to prevent any such challenge. That's now the position of the rulers of the country that outspends probably the rest of the world combined in means of violence, or close to that. And it's now forging new and very dangerous paths over near unanimous world opposition. Most striking and dangerous of them is the development of lethal weaponry in space, which really does pose a threat to survival of the species. Well, I mentioned I was quoting someone else. It's important who it was. It was Dean Acheson, a respected elder statesman, senior advisor of the Kennedy administration. Quotes what he said in 1963, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost led to terminal nuclear war. The roots of the missile crisis were a campaign of international terrorism that the Kennedy administration was carrying out in order to carry out what's now called regime change in Cuba. And we know why. Part of the freedom that we've obtained, if we want to use it, is that we have unusual access to internal secret government documents. They get declassified. There's thousands of pages of them on this. We can choose to ignore them if we want, or we can look. And if we look, we find that the reasons for the campaign of international terrorism were that the very existence of the Castro government is a successful challenge to U.S. policies that go back 150 years. What does that mean? Well, it's 150 years of U.S. policy saying you follow our orders or else. And the existence of that regime was successful defiance of that. Furthermore, it was regarded as a threat because of the possible spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which has great appeal to people in the region who suffer from similar forms of oppression. We got to stop that. 150 years of policy tell us that. Well, that was the reason for the international terrorist campaign, led right to the missile crisis, almost nuclear war, just learned how close it was. After the crisis was over, the terrorist campaign was renewed, along with economic strangulation, and right at that point, Dean Acheson informed the American Society of International Law that no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its power, position, or prestige. Well, that's approximately the Bush doctrine of September 1992. This is the opposite end of the political spectrum, remember. And that's important to know. We want to understand ourselves, remember what the political spectrum is. Well, why the shudders around the world and the foreign policy elite here in September, last September? Well, there's a reason. Acheson was describing policy, and it's true, that is policy. It's been so for a long time. But the national security strategy last September proclaimed it as official policy, and that's quite a difference, an important one. Actually, you want to think about this, it goes back beyond that. You can find the policy described in the early stages of the Second World War, actually before the U.S. even entered it. There you can find a clear announced discussion of what's now called the Imperial Grand Strategy. So even before the U.S. entered the war, there were study groups of high-level planners from the Council on Foreign Relations, kind of the foreign policy elite, and the State Department trying to decide what to do in the post-war world. And they concluded that in the post-war world, the United States must hold, I'm quoting it now, must hold unquestioned power and must act to ensure limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that interfere with U.S. global designs. That's the September National Security Strategy. And they also recognized that the foremost requirement to secure these ends is rapid fulfillment of a program of complete rearmament. That's a central component of an integrated policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States. That's 1940. At that time, those ambitions were limited to what they called the non-German world. They expected that Germany might win the European war at least. And the non-German world was going to be organized under the United States rule as what they called a grand area that included the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. Well, shortly after that, Russia beat back the Nazi armies at Stalingrad, and it became fairly clear that Germany would ultimately be defeated, and these plans were then extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible, and they were implemented after the Second World War. They've been described since, as in Dean Acheson's comment, and now they're official policy. Well, that's all important to know. In a society that really valued its freedom, I wouldn't have to be saying this. Everybody would have learned it in high school. These are really important things to know about ourselves. There's plenty more like it. Well, let's go back to last September. One important development, which did cause plenty of concern around the world, foreign policy elite here, was the proclamation of the national security strategy. Something else happened in September. September was the opening of the political campaign for the midterm elections. And that was combined with an enormous propaganda campaign which began to present Iraq, Saddam Hussein, as an imminent threat to the survival of the United States, with insinuations that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attacks. Actually, if you look at this morning's New York Times, Karl Rove, who's George Bush's minder, as they call him in Iraq, he describes it this morning. He says the goal is that in order to pursue the domestic agenda of the administration, it's necessary to frighten the population. You have to make the population feel that they have to shelter under, behind the powerful leader who's going to save them from destruction. You can do that. You can pursue your domestic agenda. Otherwise, not. He's talking about what we have to do what they're going to have to do in the future. But he also says, yeah, that's what they did in the past, and that's correct. In September, Condoleezza Rice showed up with her prediction that the next thing we're going to hear about Saddam Hussein is a mushroom cloud. They're planning to destroy us. And then there came a series of outlandish lies repeated passionately by Bush and others distributed quite uncritically by the media, and it had an immediate effect. You take a look at polls by September, after this campaign began, roughly 60% of the population believed it and continue to believe it. 60% of the population, plus or minus, believes that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. They got to keep repeating it to keep that level up. About half the population, about a month ago, it's probably higher now, believe that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attack, that Iraqis were on the plains. Those beliefs turn out to be highly correlated with support for the war, and it's understandable. If you think that Saddam Hussein's an imminent threat, already destroyed the World Trade Center, planning something new, maybe a nuclear bomb, yeah, then it's understandable that you'd want to do something to get rid of him. That's a remarkable achievement of government media propaganda. You have to bear in mind that this is unique to the United States. Nowhere else where anyone believes anything like this, nor is it believed here by anybody who knows anything, like the CIA or foreign policy analysts. But it has been imposed on the population. And that's impressive. It's not the first time, but it's impressive. As far as it was aimed at the election, and for the election it just barely worked. They barely managed to maintain control. Tens of thousands of votes, not much. And something similar is going to be needed for the next election. That's what Rove says this morning. It says for the next election we've got to create an image of George Bush as a powerful leader, a savior, who by then will be marching off to slay some new dragons. So it's going to be something to do next year. Well, for the guys in power, the current administration, all of this is kind of reflexive. It's just second nature. Remember that this is almost the same people who ran the country in the Reagan-Bush 1 administrations. They had 12 years to do it. It's sort of astonishing when you put yourself in the position of the Martian observer again, and recognize that it's just elementary sanity, if you want to figure out what these guys are up to ask what they did during their first tenure in power. It's 12 years, not ancient history. 1981 to 92, what'd they do? Well, it's interesting that it's almost never investigated. Do a search and see how often people bring up what they did the first time around. Well, if you do it, you'll find that right now they're following almost exactly the same script in detail. The first thing the Reaganites did when they came into office in 1981, first thing they did was drive the country into a deep deficit. Bush administration did exactly the same thing. This time, the way they did it was by a huge tax cut benefiting very tiny top percentage of the population, and by the biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years, quoting the Wall Street Journal. But it's a fact, biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years, that goes to the rich, huge tax cut for the rich. Well, that causes a problem, just as it did in the Reagan years. Got a deficit, you have to have what's called fiscal responsibility. You know, long, gloomy faces from the economic czars about fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility means you got to cut services for the population. You got to cut benefits that help people. You keep the benefits to the rich. That's what the federal spending and a tax cut are about. Well, during the Reagan years, that's exactly what was done, and it was harmful. It was harmful even to economic growth, although it was some, but it was very harmful to the general population. It was 10 years of either stagnation or decline for most people. U.S. working hours went to the highest in the industrial world. For incomes either stagnated or declined, working conditions declined. This was called a welcome development of transcendent importance by the Wall Street Journal, which tells you exactly what was going on. Well, it was highly unpopular, as you can imagine. There's a lot of mythology about Reagan's popularity. It's simply untrue. In fact, at the end, by 1992, he was ranked as the most unpopular living ex-president, right next to Richard Nixon, well below Carter and Ford. Well, how'd they stay in power? Pressing the panic button every year, just what they're doing now. So they started right off with, it was recognized right away that Libya is a very convenient punching bag. It's completely defenseless. Everybody hates it. You can do what you want. So they started attacking Libya right away and presenting Libya as a threat. In 1981, Reagan was hiding in the White House because he had to be protected from Libyan hitmen who were wandering around the streets of Washington, and nobody could do anything about them. They're going to kill our leader. Well, somehow he escaped. Libya was trying to expel us from the world. He said nothing less than that. 2 years later came that air base in Grenada, which the Russians were going to use to bomb us. And then there was Nicaragua, 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. Remember that? They were really close. And waving copies of Mein Kampf, according to the Secretary of State. A real threat. Reagan called a national emergency in 1985 to defend the country from the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. The Martian would be dying of laughter, I guess, but people here didn't laugh. In fact, if you look at that, that was renewed annually right through the 80s. You take a look at it, it's almost the same wording as the congressional resolution in October 2002 about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Imminent threat to the security of the United States. You've got to do something. In the 1980s, it meant a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Ended up with the U.S. had to defy the World Court. The Security Council continued, destroyed the country practically. The other countries even worse. In 1988, George Bush was able to get elected, George Bush #1, but only by invoking the threat of black criminal rapists. Willie Horton, you remember that? That's how he got elected, terrified everyone. There were crime frenzies, drug frenzies, just on and on. The international policies then were the same as now. The Reagan administration came into office in 1981, declaring that a war on terror would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, a war against depraved opponents of civilization itself and a return to barbarism in our time, on and on. And it very quickly turned into a terrorist war. They devastated Central America, the Middle East. It was all over the world. The U.S. supported South Africa right through the 1980s. The Reagan administration had to find ways to get around congressional legislation calling sanctions. They were able to increase trade and support for South Africa right to the end. Just in the Reagan years alone, South African depredations in the surrounding countries, in Angola and Mozambique, killed about 1.5 million people. It's not small. That's when ends up with Colin Powell, the moderate, as National Security Advisor. In 1988, the U.S. declared Nelson Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That's part of the reason for supporting the South African apartheid regime. In 1987, December 1987, the U.S. voted against, that means essentially vetoed, the strongest UN resolution, General Assembly resolution, condemning terror in all its forms. It's the strongest resolution the UN has passed. The U.S. voted against it. U.S. and Israel alone voted against it. The reason was it had a paragraph in it which said that though they condemn terrorism and have to do everything to stop it, nothing in this resolution prevents the people from struggling against racist and colonialist regimes or foreign military occupation. And the U.S. doesn't accept that. We don't think people have a right to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. racist and colonialist regimes referred to South Africa. Military occupation referred to Israel. The U.S. alone voted against it, Israel, reflexively. Accordingly, it's not reported. And it's not part of history, except that it is part of history. And it tells you a lot about what's going on. It's December 1987. Well, it continues like that. At that time, they were constrained. There was a deterrent. There's a limit on what you can do. The deterrent's gone. You go on to the national security strategy, uses September 11th as a pretext. The pretext is used by states all over the world. The Russians immediately used it as a pretext for stepping up their really vicious terrorist atrocities in Chechnya, assuming correctly they'd get U.S. endorsement for it. China did the same. Israel did the same in the occupied territories. It's all over. Also, states all over the world, from the Central Asian terrorist dictatorships that Bush backs to the more democratic countries all over the world, it was used as a pretext to discipline their own populations. We know what happened here. The Bush administration has made extraordinary claims, and they've been upheld by the courts to a large extent. They've claimed the right to imprison people, including U.S. citizens, without charge, without access to lawyers or family, and to do so indefinitely until the president declares that an emergency is over, which means executive authority. That's an astonishing claim. George Bush is supposed to have a bust of Winston Churchill on his desk that was given to him by his friend Tony Blair. Churchill had some things to say about this. You might listen to them. He said, "The power of the executive to cast a man into prison without formulating any charge known to the law and to deny him the judgment of his peers is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist." That was that's what is being claimed and implemented by the United States. Churchill said this in 1943. Britain was in very serious straits at that time. They were under attack by the most murderous military force in history and came close to being destroyed. That's the moment at which Churchill declared that. And whatever you think about the threats to the United States, they're nothing like that. And he's right. It is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist or Washington right now. Those are just plain facts. You know, take a look. And it's getting worse. There's a new Justice Department proposal, which is being called Patriot 2. It was secret, but it was leaked. It was leaked by somebody who didn't like it. And there have been a couple of reports about it in the press. You can actually read it. It's posted on the internet. NYU law professor Jack Balkin, who wrote about it, says the following: there is no civil right, not even the precious right of citizenship, that this administration will not abuse to secure ever greater control over American life. And if you read the proposal, he's exactly right. It even grants the Justice Department the right to take away citizenship just by inference, what they call inference, not any actual actions. They somehow infer from something they don't like that they don't like you, they can take away your citizenship. Nothing's ever been claimed like that. That goes far beyond what Churchill described as in the highest degree odious. Well, you know, whether that's implemented or not is up to us. Alan Gilbert here has a recent book which he opens by quoting James Madison, who warned about those who seize upon dangers abroad to blind your eyes to dangers at home. That rings pretty true, worth thinking about. Well, September 11th was the pretext. National Security Council security strategy was announced. Election campaign came along. The doctrine was announced, the doctrine of war against anybody you don't like, preventive war. The purpose is to establish that as a norm of behavior, what international legal scholars will call a new norm in international law. But to establish a norm, you have to do more than declare it. You have to illustrate it. You have to carry it out. You got to show that you're going to do it. Then it becomes a norm if you're a rich and powerful country, not if you're somebody else. Well, how do you do it? You got to pick a target. Target has to meet several conditions. One condition is it has to be defenseless. You got to make sure that you're going to have an overwhelming victory so you can rejoice over the destruction of people from a safe distance. Secondly, it's got to be important. So like there's no point going after, Burundi or some place like that. It's got to be a place that matters. Okay, what state satisfies those two conditions? Completely defenseless and very important. Well, that's Iraq. It's been utterly devastated by a decade of sanctions. It's the weakest country in the region, which is why it's not feared, no matter how much it's hated. Even in Kuwait and Iran, which Saddam invaded, not feared. In fact, for the last 5 years, they've been trying to reintegrate it into the regional system over strong U.S. objectives. It's the United States that fears it alone, just like it feared Nicaragua and Grenada and other demons. And it's extremely important. It has the second largest oil reserves in the world. Back as far back as 1945, the State Department described Persian Gulf oil resources as, in their words, a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Ever since then, the U.S. has been determined to control it. It's a leading principle of foreign policy. Actually, it goes back before, but it was the British before. And it's understandable. You don't give away a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. It's important to recognize that that means control, not access. The U.S. didn't need the oil. In fact, it barely needs it today. You look at intelligence projections, they're expecting to rely on more secure Atlantic Basin resources, Western Africa, Western Hemisphere. But they want to control it, just as they did after the Second World War. And there's a reason for that. If you control a stupendous source of strategic power, you control the world. That's a lever of world control. You have what planners at the time called veto power over other countries. You can also set prices and production levels within the range that you want, and you can make sure that the profits flow back into the right pockets. It is an enormous to gain control over this resource and to have probably military bases there is a tremendous achievement for world control, if that's what you're aiming at. You read counter-arguments to this, and they're worth looking at. So it's argued that can't be true because the costs of reconstruction are going to be greater than the profits that will be made. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but it's totally irrelevant. And the reason is because the costs of reconstruction are going to be paid by the taxpayer, by you. And the profits are going to go right into the pockets of the energy corporations. So yeah, doesn't matter how they balance out, it's just another taxpayer subsidy to the rich. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. So all the discussions are completely irrelevant. The profits will go to, Bechtel Corporation or Dick Cheney's Halliburton Empire or one thing or another, which will be chosen to what will be called rebuild Iraq at taxpayer expense. That's part of the way in which you transfer wealth and power from the population to the rich. Many ways, and that's one. Is there another way to proceed at this point? Yeah, there sure is. The United States could pay reparations to Iraq. That would be proper. And remember what it is. I mean, you're not reading about it in the newspapers, but you all know. It's reparations from 20 years of devastation of Iraq. First 10 years of support for Saddam Hussein, right through his worst atrocities. The guy's now in office. They didn't care about the atrocities, continued to support him, provide him with means to develop weapons of mass destruction. They even said why they were doing it. It didn't have to do with the war with Iran. It continued after Iran. The reason was because of, as George Bush #1 explained, his administration, our duty to support American exporters. That's why we had to support Saddam Hussein after the gassing of the Kurds and everything else. And then they added the usual boilerplate about Saddam Hussein being a source of stability and, we can help improve the human rights situation and so on. That went right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. First mistake. It didn't follow orders. The other crimes were fine. Then comes the war and a decade of sanctions, which have devastated the population, civilian population, and strengthened Saddam Hussein, and furthermore made the population more dependent on him. I mean, he's a murderous tyrant, but a very efficient one. He had a very efficient food distribution system which people were dependent on to stay alive. The World Food Organization says the most efficient food distribution system they know of. They say they can't duplicate it even by half. Monster, but an efficient monster, not the first one in history. So it forced the population to be dependent on him. It devastated the civilian society, strengthened Saddam Hussein. That's one reason why he's still there. Otherwise, he'd probably have been overthrown by now. Remember that Saddam Hussein was not the only monster who was supported by the guys now in Washington. They had quite an entourage that they'd collected. They were supporting, among others, Marcos and Duvalier and Suharto and Mobutu, who was the first foreign leader invited to the Bush White House. They loved them so much. Ceausescu, who's easily comparable to Saddam Hussein, vicious, murderous tyrant, supported up until the day he was overthrown by the people now in office. Every single one of those guys was overthrown from within. Why didn't it happen to Saddam, even though they were being supported by the United States? Why didn't it happen to Saddam Hussein? Well, the Westerners who know Iraq best have been talking about this for years. You don't read about them in the American media. You can't find the names in the New York Times index. You can read them in Canada or overseas, England or elsewhere, namely the administrators of the UN so-called oil for food programs, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck. Both of them resigned in protest against what they called the genocidal effect of the program, the sanctions, and the fact that they were destroying the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they've been pointing out for years that the way to overthrow Saddam Hussein is from within, just like every other gangster that was supported by the people now in Washington. Can't happen if you destroy the civilian society and you strengthen the dictator and you make people dependent on him. The main effect of the sanctions hasn't harmed Saddam Hussein and strengthened him, but it's kept him from being overthrown. Otherwise, chances are he would have gone the way of Ceausescu and the rest of them a long time ago. But an internal revolt is unacceptable to the United States, just as Saddam's leaving Iraq is unacceptable, as they announced at the summit meeting. The reason is very simple. It doesn't leave the United States in charge. It leaves the Iraqi people in charge, and that's no good. At the Azores summit, Bush and Blair announced it explicitly. They said, even if Saddam Hussein goes, we're going to invade anyway, because we have to impose the regime of our choice, not the choice of the Iraqis, whatever that might be. That's critical. Well, that gives you some tasks for people here. One is to ensure the least harmful outcomes, whatever can be done. Another is to try to get to the point where we can provide reparations to Iraqis, and if we can't get to that level of honesty, at least to provide aid that they can use to rebuild the society the way that they want to, and not the way somebody in Crawford tells them to. The next